how do we take our humans through this wormhole? Because there's a lot of chatter about AI and what it's going to do and what it's going to eliminate and what it's going to help. And so how do we take our humans through this just from an emotional standpoint, from an understanding? Work is a very existential thing. Humans have been working since the beginning of time. So we get value from work. So in a world where the tasks that you used to get great personal value from, are no longer the tasks we need you to do, how do we take you through that change and to that curve to get you to the higher stack of work that we actually need done?
Welcome to the Future of Less Work, where we're exploring how work is transforming one puzzle piece at a time. I'm Nirit Cohen. With me today is Kelly Jones, Chief People Officer at Cisco. I'm really excited to have this conversation with Kelly because Cisco isn't just adapting the future of work, it's powering it actively. As a company whose products shape how organizations collaborate, work flexibly, and integrate AI, it's fascinating to see how they apply the same principles internally to transform their own workforce. Welcome to the Future of Less Work, Kelly.
Thank you so much, Narit. This is a topic I love so much, so I'm really happy to be with you.
Thank you. And I always start with this question. So, if the future of work is an unfinished puzzle, what's the piece you work on?
Oh gosh, I would say rethinking work and redefining leadership for the future.
Okay, fabulous. Exactly. So I led with this, right? Cisco is part of how we shape work, remote work, and all the other aspects of the changing workplace. So how do you see that affect rethinking work internally?
Uh, in terms of us reshaping work at Cisco?
Yes, as employers.
Yeah. It's interesting. This conversation that's been going on very pervasively around AI and kind of how that's reshaping work, leadership, the workplace. We're thinking about all of that in terms of how are we going to be able to integrate solutions that not only help us run our business more efficiently, but also really enhance the employee experience. And if you think about it, talent management and kind of HR professionals, people that do what we do, we're sitting in this really interesting inflection point where everything from how we find talent, how we move talent, how we engage with that talent has an opportunity to be completely disrupted. So, where we're sitting, we're really trying to ensure that we're reimagining the workforce of the future. We're building resilient teams, that have all of those. Yeah, I sometimes refer to them as soft skills. And someone corrected me and said, "No, Kelly, those are power skills." And
Our
I'm
skills these days, yeah.
I love that. Isn't that better? Power skills. So rather than soft skills, I've adopted, I said, I'm going to steal that, and I have stolen it, and I'm referring to them more as power skills. So we're really focused on how do we ensure that we have a super resilient workforce in the future that is ready to adapt, change, collaborate with all of the significant disruption that's coming.
So we're recording this and it's kind of that milestone of 5 years to COVID or to the, beginning of how we understood COVID. How do you see what's changed?
Yeah, it's interesting. This conversation around post pandemic and what it put into the work ecosystem is the fact that work can be done in many different ways. And that when you give individuals agency and flexibility over where and kind of when they do some of that work and really focus on the results and not so much the where and the when of how they're doing it, they can do amazing things. And this conversation around return to office is a really interesting one because there is work that is done better live without a doubt, and there's data that shows that there are certain types of decision making and work you need to be proximate to your teams to do. But I think that one of the biggest disruptors that we've seen is that the humans in the ecosystem have realized they can get work done, and not all work, the asynchronous work, does not need to be done live. So there's this element of flexibility and individual advocacy, I think, that is coming into the workforce, that now when you see the massive RTOs, everyone needs to come back every day, people are really pushing against this because they've seen that it can work. So the flexibility and agency, I would say, is one of the big ones. One of the second ones, and I would actually argue that well-being's always been critical in the workforce. But if you think about what happened during the pandemic, it really brought this to the forefront. And companies that were not having conversation about mental health and well-being started having these conversations. The
Yeah,
barriers.
and I want to circle back to that one, but let me just stop you for a second. Just stay with the flexibility one for a second. And you talked about how we have to also rethink leadership. And part of the real big pushback on flexibility is because we taught leaders to lead in the physical space of the office, right? The meetings, the conference rooms, the presentations, the corridors. And there seems to be a pushback, mostly from the top, as a return to office. And I keep saying you can't return to the future. That's not a possible direction. And we see the pushback from the bottom. But from the top, it's almost like they're uncomfortable with these empty office buildings. So
Yeah.
what's I mean, I know that Cisco's thinking about this in a different way. How have you evolved?
Yeah. It's interesting. I think it's a little bit about the real estate and the spaces. You have these companies that have invested huge dollar amounts and that are conflating the idea of having a culture with having a space. This idea that like culture is what you do in the office. What you do in the office is a part of your culture. It's not entirely your culture. And so the way that we're reimagining office spaces, like a lot of other companies, post pandemic, we actually realized we had a lot of space that was not being fully utilized. So we stopped asking the question about should people come into work or not. And we flipped it around and started asking the question, how do humans do their best work? What is the environment that needs to be present for people to do their best work? In some cases, it's presence. In some cases, it isn't. And so we've gone to more of a collaboration center model, whereby we have main collaboration centers in across the U.S. and across the world that we bring people together in. But we actually ended up closing many of the offices that had very low occupancy rates because what we realized was, it wasn't benefiting us. It wasn't benefiting the people that were there because they weren't coming in and necessarily collaborating with their teams. The other thing I will say is, we had an unfair advantage in this, Narit, in that we developed collaboration technologies. And so if you think about how we were virtual and hybrid way before the pandemic. And so it was a little bit of an unfair advantage coming into it. So retraining people to be able to work flexibly, it wasn't as hard. Although I will say, we still see what you mentioned that leaders, we did train them to lead in a physical space. And so now we're asking them to show up in a different way. And I think this is one of many elements of how leadership is evolving and needs to evolve for the future.
So that's actually fascinating. And that's why I was so excited talking with you because you do have a culture that has evolved around products that are about remote and distributed collaboration. Can you put your finger on what it is that, for example, you figured out and you know how to do that some of the organizations who've grown up within office buildings maybe need to learn?
Yeah. I think the first thing is you have to have a plan. If you're going to collaborate virtually with a team, you have to have a set of guiding principles that say, here's how we're showing up for each other as a team. Here are the moments we'll be live. And I'll give you an example. So, my leadership team, we're distributed all over the world. We get together consciously and to do certain types of work. When we know we are strategy planning or we're driving towards decision making, we are live. We have sub teams that will come together. We have a project going on right now in our hiring organization that's deeply cross functional, has people from across many different business units, many different time zones, geographies. And we know that there are 4 gateways in that project. We will need to put people together in the office to make progress. And so having that contract at the beginning that says, here's when we will be live, here's when we won't. But also, here's how we're going to use our collaboration technologies. When is it a WebEx Teams ping versus an email? When is it a WebEx Teams ping versus a meeting? This is always a big one for me because I think sometimes we all start to feel like we attend meetings for a living. It's our job. We're professional meeting attenders. So setting up those kind of cultural constructs within your team about how you're going to use the technologies and how you're going to not use them is really important. And then I think there's a third dimension that we've always been quite flexible. We've always been an organization that says we give people a high bar and say, this is what we need you to meet or achieve, but we don't micromanage how they achieve those results. And so if you were a working parent at Cisco 10 years ago, prior to the pandemic, you experienced that flexibility and you learned how to manage your time and your work in an integrated way that didn't feel like you were punching a clock. We don't punch clocks, we don't monitor hours, we monitor results and we monitor impact. And so I think it's probably those 3 things.
So that leads us right back to well-being, right? So I think we clearly see, I call this a changing social contract around work. So the things that people realized in the pandemic that, life is short. Every day I come to work is a day of my life I exchange better be worth it. And we saw
Yeah.
them make changes. And I don't think they're willing to go back to the way things were. So we covered flexibility. Where else do you see this going on?
Well, I mean, certainly to your point in the well-being space, I think that is a really big one. And I think the interesting part about this is well-being typically has felt like this, we're a nice company, we're going to focus on employee well-being. That broke out during the pandemic for sure. But I think going forward, the narrative on this one is going to change. Well-being isn't just this thing we do during the pandemic because we care about our employees. By the way, I believe most companies do care about their employees. We care deeply about our employees at Cisco, but we do it because yes, it's the right thing for the humans, but it's also the right thing for our culture and kind of for driving this idea of a high performance culture. So I've been trying to lead this one woman band on this one. I don't work in the well-being space. I'm not a well-being expert, but I've seen on the front lines the impact of this. This is not something that we should roll back now that the pandemic is over, because mental health is something, it's like your physical health. You have mental health every day. It's mental health. It can be good, it can be bad, you can be challenged, but it's going on every single day. And tending to well-being and mental health with your employees actually helps drive productivity and business results. So that one I think is a really, really big one.
Yeah, so mental health is definitely one of them, and I actually go back to flexibility. I think flexibility is part of well-being because stress is about your ability to create control over your work and your life and everything in between, right?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So let's talk about AI. One of the conversations that's going on. So you started touching on AI as a tool for personalization and for teaching, and actually we started to talk about the power skills and the human skills. But before we get there, right? One of the conversations going on these days is we'll bring in AI. It can think instead of people. It can do the work of people, right? We'll let the people go. Let's have a $1 billion company with no people. I don't think you believe that, but I'm kind of curious to see where you see the people aspect fits in.
It's really interesting. This conversation around the future of work with AI, and without a doubt, it's going to transform the workforce management, how we develop, how we retain. It will be transformed by AI. But most of the conversation has been, to your point, how do we drive productivity into the system? How do we do things quicker, better, faster, by leveraging the technology? What's missing from the conversation really is uplifting the employee experience with AI. And I actually believe I don't believe in the dystopian future that AI is coming for all of our jobs. And I actually am starting to dislike the term humans in the loop. I think it's humans at the wheel. It's not humans in the loop, because we have a unique time, particularly as HR professionals right now, to transform how work is going to get done. And my belief is we can actually make it better for the humans that come to work. The humans that come to work every day, how do we use it to enhance the employee experience? Because it will help with company bottom line, but it's also going to help with the experience of our employees. And that was where the hyper personalization kind of prediction comes in. If you think about how much time you spend at work, trying to manage your learning, trying to manage your career, trying to manage your benefits, if we can remove friction and make that simpler and actually take some of these tension points for our employees and make them easier. And if you think about like a real world example of that, training is probably one of my favorites. And this is one
Yeah.
that we're really looking at for the future. You can actually have an AI powered platform that doesn't just recommend training, but integrates it into your daily workflow. And an example of this would be like if we have an employee who wants to be a leader and they say, I'm really interested in a leadership role. How might you not just take traditional leader training, but do simulations for decision making in scenarios that actually kind of go in and adjust based on how you do, and meets you where you are in terms of your training and gives you real time insights and feedback as to the areas that you're showing up really well, the areas that you might need extra help in. But I think there's a huge opportunity to use this technology with humans at the wheel, not just in the loop, because in the loop kind of implies, we're working with the machines, and some of us will be working with the machines, but many of us need to be directing the work by the machines. And so humans at the wheel, if you think about leading these very integrated teams, because I don't believe $1 billion companies with no employees. What I do think is we're going to have highly integrated, I'm going to say hybrid workforces, but I'm not talking about location when I say that. I'm talking about humans, humanoids, and agents. And so leaders are going to have to figure out how to deliver work through teams that are comprised of all three of those.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I would even take it a step further. One of the things I've been having this argument. Some of it's on mic to with actually CEOs for quite some time now, and frankly, if the technology can do the work, right, then what makes you you, right? How does it differentiate one company from the other? So, and I think the essence of it is humans. And we started with culture, right? You told me we came ready into COVID because we were already flexible and we were, by design because that's what the product we were making. I think that is what makes Cisco, which is different than what makes Microsoft, right? And I don't think we understand the nuances of we talked about the soft skills, power skills. In fact, I don't even think we have the words to describe the nuances of the people skills involved in making you you. And I think that's what we will end up figuring out, because technology will take pieces of it, but it can't take those
That's
pieces.
right. And if it takes the pieces that are very tactical, and the way I've been talking about this is as a people leader, you have management things you do and you have leadership things you do. And some of the management things you do are very tactical and operational. Some of the leadership things you do are deeply human. And that to me is the incredible irony here is we're entering this kind of unprecedented level of disruption as to how tasks are performed. And this is largely due to advances in technology. But I believe that this disruption, it's actually going to lead to a more deeply human work experience for the humans in the ecosystem because
Yeah.
we'll start to bifurcate. What are the deeply human skills that we need to navigate this, but also differentiate us from the agents that can do some things better than we can? There will be some things that will be done better by agents without a doubt. And so my prediction on that is we lean deeply into those things and allow the agents to do them. And as a byproduct, we're going to end up in an interesting era where we're actually the technology is going to force us to be more deeply human in the way we work.
Yeah. And I also think we'll learn what are the deeply human skills that make a leader, right for a specific situation, different from a different leader. I think there's a lot of that. How do you measure skills? How do you understand them? How do you put the right words around the nuances of skills that we'll end up figuring out? It's going to be an interesting era for HR for sure.
If you work in this field, you're going to have a fun next decade or two.
Have you figured out how to hire for skills? We've been talking about that forever, and yet we still don't quite know how to, because most of them are self-reported.
Yeah, I mean, hiring for skills, if you think of it as the traditional, you know, coding skills or, going back to that old word, kind of hard skills, you can certainly do skills assessments. But when you're hiring for some of the more soft, more human skills, it's difficult because you do have an element of subjectivity, in that process.
Yep.
And that's something that we're actually looking at as we're kind of redefining what work is going to look like and what some of the critical skills are for our people leaders. How do we interview for that, promote for that, reward for that? It does become difficult because it is a little bit subjective, but there are ways that you can get at it. One way you can get at it is I'm actually a big believer in this element of like behavioral interviewing and people, the way you've worked in the past is usually an indicator to how you're going to work in the future. But another way that we can get to that is understanding sentiment analysis from your team. How are you showing up in these spaces? And we do a lot of, you may know, listening at Cisco. We have quarterly engagement pulses at the team level. We have kind of biannual real deal listening surveys where we deeply understand where our employees are at any given point, how they feel about their relationship with their manager. And so there is a way, and AI actually can play a big role here in terms of analyzing that data and helping leaders to calibrate. Because I do believe that no people leader comes in and says, I'm going to create a soul destroying team where people hate to work here and everyone, nobody wants to give any discretionary effort. I do think there's a deep lack of self awareness. And so the other thing AI can do is help leaders develop self awareness around these things. There's been a lot of research done around AI coaching and what is the role that AI
Yes.
will play in coaching. And this is really wild when you think about it. There's a huge tilt towards people being comfortable being coached by AI because they feel less judgment. I'm not being coached by someone who is a peer or someone who is an assigned coach from my company where I have to worry about, are they in charge of my promotional prospects? Being coached by AI and scenario planning with AI actually is a little bit of a safe zone in which to do it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense. In fact, I was going to ask you about that when once we moved a lot of the work to the digital space, a lot of new startups and solutions came up using the data. So technically, right, somebody could record this, right, and then give each one of us separately feedback on our role and how we can do better next time. I think the reaction was, I don't want you to use it against me,
Yeah.
but if it's feedback for me, that'd be great.
That's right. And so if
Yeah.
you think about this in the flow of work, at any given moment, an employee, say I work in communications and I'm working on a brief about something. I can actually take that brief. I can use the technology to say, help me troubleshoot this, find the flaws in this for me, make this piece of work better. So before you actually submit that work, you can actually get a higher quality piece of work. And something I do a lot with AI is I use it to scenario plan and to kind of say, this is my plan. Tell me what could go wrong. And I know that sounds very negative, but sometimes as humans, we fall in love with our ideas. We fall in love with them, we marry them, we deeply like where we're going with them, and it will create blinders. If we start to really feel like we're right, if we're in love with our idea, what AI can do is kind of objectively troubleshoot that with you in a non-judgmental environment, because you're not bringing it to your boss, someone who's actually has some say so over your pay, your promotional trajectory. You're bringing it to something that is there for you, to your point, to actually help you make your work better. I think
Yep,
that's
sounds like
really
you're
interesting.
optimistic about the future, that we can better ourselves with AI. I really love that. So I do want to kind of start asking you that question about kind of the biggest challenge for HR in the coming year. What do you see that being?
I think one of the biggest challenges that we're hitting right now, and as I talk to a lot of other CHROs, there's really two things. When we think about this revolution that's coming, there's a huge expectation in the people space and in the HR space that everything's going to get turned on its head. So there's a lot of people looking to us saying, navigate us through this. So if you think about how AI is changing tasks, take it right down to the task level. There's a mapping here that goes to, what are the tasks that are changing? What does better being automated? What doesn't? And where do you start? Increasingly, leaders are looking to their HR teams and their workforce planning teams to say, help me. I have this workforce. Help me understand the tasks that exist across my workforce. Where should I be looking to automate? Where should I be looking to have the deeply human skills? And so I think a lot of us that's a big ask if you think about it. We're literally talking about redefining how work gets done. And this is kind of a
Yep.
once in a lifetime thing. So
Yeah.
if you talk about what keeps you up at night, one of the things that keeps me up at night is making sure we do that well, and that we do it at the speed and the pace that we need to meet where our business is going. I think that's one of the large ones that we're leaning into. The second is, and I really want to emphasize this one, how do we take our humans through this wormhole? Because there's a lot of chatter about AI and what it's going to do and what it's going to eliminate and what it's going to help. And so how do we take our humans through this, just from an emotional standpoint, from an understanding? Work is a very existential thing. Humans have been working since the beginning of time. So we get value from work. So in a world where the tasks that you used to get great personal value from, are no longer the tasks we need you to do, how do we take you through that change and to that curve to get you to the higher stack of work that we actually need done? And that's one that we can't lose sight of, because I think we have that responsibility to our employees.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think goes back to work will not be taken away completely, right? It will just evolve and change as it has in the past. Wonderful. One last question I always wrap up with, instead of an answer, what is the one question you think we should all be asking ourselves these days about the future of work?
I think we should be asking ourselves, do we have the right people at the table defining what this future is going to look like? Because I feel that creatives, artists, humanists, philosophers, ethicists. I don't know if that's the right word. Like, we need to have the voices at the table when we create the future. It can't just be driven. And this is someone who works at a tech company. It can't just be driven from tech. We can't allow the technology to lead us down the road for what everything else looks like. I think we should be asking ourselves, do we have the right people at the table as we're trying to craft this future?
That is wonderful. Thank you so much, Kelly Jones, for joining me today. For more about Kelly and her work at Cisco, check out the links in the podcast description. Thank you for joining us. The Future of Less Work, where we're piecing together the ever changing puzzle of work. The conversation doesn't end here. We're not finished. And as we just discussed, we should probably be inviting more varied people to talk to in this conversation. And remember, the new social contract is a win-win between people and organizations. Your best people no longer work because they have to. They don't work because you tell them to, and not because you measure them on it. They work because they want to, because by working for you is their way of achieving their purpose in life. Until next time.